Welcome to our spring Women's Leadership Forum titled Stopping Violence Against Utah Girls and Women. I'm Dr. Susan Madsen, founding director of the Utah Women in Leadership Project and also the Karen Haight Huntsman Endowed Professor of Leadership in the John M. Huntsman School of Business at Utah State University. And I'm the host and will be the panel moderator today. This event furthers the mission of the Utah Women in Leadership Project, which is to strengthen the impact of Utah girls and women. We serve Utah and its residents by first producing relevant, trustworthy, and applicable research, second, creating and gathering valuable resources, and third, convening trainings and events that inform, inspire, and ignite growth and change for all Utahns. And thanks so much to our sponsors, the John M. Huntsman School of Business and the Utah Education Network, for making this event possible. So I'll be moderating the panel discussion today, and I'll have many questions. I have a bunch of them. However, we want to hear from you and we want to get your questions. So we're going to be using the Q&A throughout the discussion today. I'll be looking at that, and panelists will also too. So submit your questions anytime in the Q&A, and the panelists and I will be watching that and answering that as we can. So what I'd like to do today, especially with our first question, is to introduce one of our panelists. Instead of reading all the bios up front, I'm going to read one bio of one of our panelists and then ask her to answer the first question. Then I'll introduce the second one. We have 4 fabulous panelists today. And then we'll just dive right in the questions. So before I introduce our first one, let me tell you what our question is. I would love each panelist to talk about why are you so passionate about the topic that we are talking about today? Maybe even what drew you to this work for your full-time employment. And if you feel like this is kind of a core purpose or calling in your life, you know, you can talk about that too. I'd like to give a few minutes to each panelist to do that. So today we're going to start with Liliana Olvera-Arbon. I practiced that and I just botched it up, but she joined Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault over a year ago with over 10 years of experience working in social services. She demonstrated profound leadership while working at a Los Angeles-based rape center, crisis center, and later as a program coordinator at the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Her vision is to center and uplift the voices of communities marginalized by society and bring a deep commitment towards social equity and collective liberation. She is dedicated to educating people of their rights and opportunities and envisions a world free of gender-based violence. And in her spare time, Liliana enjoys taking walks to the park with her husband and her sweet dog, Daisy. I love that description, the sweet dog. So you got a sweet dog. So Liliana, again, you know, why are you passionate about this topic? You know, what's drawn you to this topic with your work?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I think that's definitely a super deep question of what draws me to the work of the anti-violence work. Like my bio shared, I did start this work in LA in Los Angeles County as a victim advocate, and wasn't quite sure, I think, what I was signing up for, what I was volunteering for. But I always reflect back to that first young girl that I met at the hospital. And I was a victim advocate who was brand new, and I was just learning everything about violence in our county, in our cities, in our backyards, right? And so when I met her, the strength that she had, the resiliency that she had really motivated me to continue in this work and really to look at ways in which we could eliminate truly sexual violence in our county, in the world, right? That truly what motivates me is to at one day not have this job, that we could actually say, we have eradicated sexual violence, right? But one of the philosophies that really has moved me since that point has been the philosophy of the last girl, that in order for us to create compassionate communities with respect, equity, and justice, one should do our work thinking of that person or child who is valued the least, who suffers the most, who comes last, right? And that philosophy really moves the way that I provide support, how I provide that training and assistance to programs to kind of reflect on how we're approaching this work and how we come in as a collective to really truly eradicate sexual violence. And as I was doing this work, I had the opportunity to meet many who I think are the last girls. When we, when I did work with janitorial workers who were being raped on the night shift, who I met with farm workers across California that really had this innate feeling that no one was out there to help them, right? And that when they heard that help was available, it was this moment of empowerment that guided them, that guided them to safety, that guided them to support. It was those incarcerated survivors that are often forgotten about in our movement, that again, as I met them, as I talked to them, as I heard their stories, really motivated me to think more of that philosophy. Who is that last person? Who is that last girl in this movement that we often forget about? And how do we center that? And so all of those kind of moments in the trajectory of my time working as a victim advocate or in a leadership position has always caused me to kind of create a system or a way to, again, do thoughtful, intentional work to center communities that are often forgotten about and are disproportionately impacted by sexual violence.
Thank you so much. And we're glad to have you in Utah because, as you know, we'll talk about it more. We've got our own struggles in Utah, as does California. So let's shift now to Chris Yadon. He joined the Unique Foundation as executive director in 2015. Most of his professional career has been in startup executive management with an emphasis in operations, marketing, and sales. He brings a valuable skill set to the organization and is deeply committed to addressing the epidemic of child sexual abuse. So Chris plays an important role as a spokesperson for the Unique Foundation. His expertise centers on heightening awareness to the epidemic of child sexual abuse, as well as educating the public on best practices for prevention and the healing services available to survivors. So Chris has been featured across several media platforms where he is often requested to contribute as an industry thought leader and expert. And Chris considers his family his greatest accomplishment. He is a grateful father of 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls, and 1 amazing grandson. They are great, aren't they, Chris, those grandchildren? He and his wife, Christy, have been married for 23 years. So Chris, would love to hear why you're so passionate about the topic.
I think the best way, Dr. Madsen, I can explain that is by telling a quick story. When I was in my early 30s, I had a close family member disclose to me that they were a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And I had one of those moments where I was like, I'm close to this person. I've known them my whole life. I know most of their deep, dark secrets. How am I just learning about this in my 30s? How could that even be possible? And then that was followed up by disclosures from both individuals, additional individuals in my family and my wife's family from that point on. And when it hits that close to home and you come to grips with the shame associated with it and the secrecy that drives it into the shadows, how could I not get involved? How could I not help solve the problem? And so I think that's what I would say. What gets me going each day is taking individual stories of people who have healed or parents who have been empowered to prevent, and then taking that to the masses, because we need to take it to the masses. So thank you for having me, Dr. Madsen. It really is a pleasure to be with you and with this amazing panel.
Thank you so much. And for those of you that don't know much about the Unique Foundation, please look them up. I mean, they do some amazing retreats for women who were sexually assaulted as children. And we think, well, that's way back then, but those kinds of experiences affect women. And Chris, you're the one that preaches, it affects everybody within their reach, their experiences, their own children, and so forth. How many years have you been doing these retreats now?
It was 6 years now.
Wow.
We're doing both here in Utah and in Georgia.
And it's grown and grown and grown, and such a need out there. And I know someone in the chat just mentioned that they were personally impacted in positive ways from one of those retreats as well. Thank you to that individual that shared that. So thank you for sharing that. So let's, the third then, Dr. Annie Isabel Fukushima is assistant professor in the Ethnic Studies Division in the School of Cultural and Social Transformation at the University of Utah. She is also a faculty fellow with the Center for Design, Arts, and Social Research. She is author of the award-winning book, Migrant Crossing, Witnessing Human Trafficking in the United States. Her research scholarship covers issues of migration, violence, race, gender, and witnessing. She's currently leading a project on visualizing gender-based violence and the lead for the creation of the University of Utah's Gender-Based Violence Consortium. Her expertise on immigration, violence, and human trafficking is recognized across the continental US, where she has served as an expert witness on human trafficking, immigration, and violence for a range of courts, immigration, civil, and criminal, in California, Colorado, Utah, and Washington in the United States. She has implemented community-based research projects to assess the needs of survivors of violence. So I hope each of you listening, you're getting from the bios why I have invited each one of these four to be with us. Annie.
Thank you for having me. What an honor to be part of this conversation. And the question of why are we passionate about what we do is such a big question. And you know, as a correct Chicana, Korean Mexican, I'm an Asian Latina scholar activist. Do I say the journey starts with my mother, who is an immigrant, with my grandmother, with you know, do I go far back in my family's history? Do I actually, start with the work that I did as an undergraduate, where I was doing grassroots organizing in Hawaii, where I grew up? Or is it the work that I did when I was in California, working with community organizations, where I was working at all levels of organization, including case management and programs coordination? There are many roles that I've inhabited that have shaped my own perspectives, but also compelled me to work in coalition with communities. And so in my book, where I look at Asian and Latinos that are trafficked in the United States, one of the things that I really focus on is the process of witnessing. For me, witnessing is, it is when we have people who are called to actions. And sometimes we're called to inaction too, depending on how we're seeing an event unfold before us, whether you are watching it on television or if you are there witnessing it in the everyday, from people that do on the ground work advocacy, or even in my own work, working in an academic institution. And so for me, my drive and my work is really about facilitating processes of witnessing and moving us together so that we can actually unsettle the way that we are seeing things, so that we can question it, think deeply about it, and enact new practices. And so that's been my journey. That's been my calling. And part of it has also been shaped by how there's so many silences in our communities. And I think that, Liliana was kind of getting at this as well, as, there's complexities of where we see violence unfold in our communities, in the workplace, in the home. And for me, it really is important to think about how there is a relationship between the public and private spheres, and that we all have a collective responsibility to that. And so I'm honored to be here and to share just a little bit of a glimmer of what drew me to the work. It was both personal, but also intellectual, and also a practice. I am doing the work of anti-violence work. I'm not just thinking about it.
Yeah, and I don't think any of us is in these conversations and work just for a paycheck. When you get into these kinds of work, it's part of who you are. It's part of what wakes you up in the morning, and just what you feel, whether you're spiritual or religious or not, what you feel your life is, an important piece of your life is supposed to be. Thank you, Annie, so much for being here. And then finally, Jen, we haven't left you out. We saved you for last, but still important to us. So Jennifer Campbell is the executive director of South Valley Services. She lived in Utah her whole life and loves it. She is married with 2 children, and she loves the mountains and seasons here, especially winter skiing. Jennifer graduated from Utah Valley University with a bachelor's degree in education and taught as a 3rd grade teacher for Jordan School District for 4 years. She also has a master's degree in public administration from Southern Utah University. She worked at South Valley Services for 10 years. She started as a volunteer and loved the mission and services so much that she never left. And in 2015, the Board of Trustees appointed Jennifer as the executive director of South Valley Services. And she also serves as a board member on the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition, and also a committee member on the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness. So Jennifer remains committed to supporting survivors of sexual and domestic violence through education, advocacy, and collaboration. Jennifer.
Yes. Well, thank you, Susan, and I don't feel like I'm the last. I would listen to all 3 of you anytime, all 4 of you actually. So I'm very happy to be here today. And I would agree, this question, I think, it's a tough question of what brought us. And as you were all reflecting, I had all of these thoughts, but for me, I would echo, some of the things that have been said. And my experiences was mentioned, I started at South Valley. I wanted to, living here in Utah, loving our state, loving the people here, I'm recognizing that there is power imbalance in so many areas for so many, and wanting to be a part of that and wanting to help. And that led me to South Valley. And as was mentioned, I was volunteering there. And when I started, we were very grassroots. We had 15 employees. We would eat lunch together every day. And I just had no idea, because my education had taken me in a different route, but seeing the resilience and the hope and the survivors that we were serving was just something that I wasn't prepared for. I was thinking that this would be very, sad and really, I didn't realize what I was going to see. And I loved the people we were serving. But I guess I was thinking of a moment. My job as a volunteer was to sort donations, like I would sort the donations and I would get rooms ready when survivors were coming in. And we had a family coming in, and it was 3 teens and their mom. And I was trying to find, sheets and pillows and all this stuff. And, we sometimes had these things, sometimes we don't, and nothing was matching. And I remember being so frustrated because I thought, this room is horrible. Like that, that was my level of understanding that point. And this family's coming in, and it was important to me that they felt that. And I'll never forget, the advocate on shift came and told me what happened when they came into that room, and their daughter started to cry. And I thought, oh no, and her mom said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "I'm so grateful that I will sleep safely tonight." And that's a voice that I hear all the time in this work, that everyone should be able to sleep safe. And when I think of what keeps me passionate about this is that's a right. People should have that. It shouldn't be a question. It shouldn't be a maybe. It shouldn't be if they're lucky enough or if they're fortunate enough. That's something that we should all have. And so I guess that's where my passion, I feel, is that I wanted to be part of a place that was a priority, and work hard to make it to be safe and to let people have a place to be safe, and then work systemically to change so that this isn't the only place. I agree with Liliana. I would love the day when I don't need to have a safe place, that it's someone's home and it's their place and they get to be there. But in the meantime, I feel privileged to offer my hand in providing some of that.
Thank you so much. You already got me a little teary-eyed, Jennifer. I appreciate that, though. Now I'd like to shift. Thank you for all those introductory comments. And I want to shift right into a topic that many are interested in who are attending today. So we know that violence against women, girls and women, particularly sexual assault and domestic violence, is really a problem around the world. But can you talk about what is happening here in Utah? And, what are some of the statistics right here in Utah? A lot of times when I talk to people, they're like, yeah, that's a problem in the world. But then you start giving statistics of Utah. Yes, it is a problem in Utah, even stronger than some other states. And Chris, let's start with you. Do you want to give us some of your perspectives about Utah and the problem it is here?
Sure. I'll focus on child sexual abuse. I'll let the others maybe weigh in on the broader statistics, but specific to child sexual abuse, the CDC does a questionnaire to high school kids every 2 years, and the last few cycles they've had the sexual violence questions asked our Utah high schoolers. So speaking specifically to our Utah high school girls, 11.3% of our high school girls report being raped before they graduate. So sometime from early childhood to graduation, 11.3. That's higher than the national average historically. When we talk about sexual assault, 21.2% of girls in Utah report having been sexually assaulted in the last 12 months. That's significantly higher than the national averages. Going to a different study that the Utah Department of Health recently released, they do an ACEs evaluation, did one in 2020. Their questions focus on defining sexual assault or child sexual abuse as touch. They report 1 in 7 to 1 in 8. So you see some variance in the statistics. And the 1 in 7 to 1 in 8, 13.1% specifically, are specific to touch sexual violence. So when you consider non-touch sexual violence, voyeurism, exposing young girls to sexually explicit materials forcefully, things like that, the rate is much higher. But just dealing with touch only, it's 13.1. So you're going to see some variance, but no matter what the variance is, it's horrific.
Yeah.
And it's alarming, and it's higher than the national average. And I think that's the message that people should take away regarding what we're dealing with here in Utah.
And even, I taught junior high for years, but you think about just even in one classroom, let's say one high school classroom, with those statistics, there are multiple girls, young women that are already suffered and gone through some of those situations, even at that age. Annie, would you share some of your perspectives? And thanks so much for your work at the University of Utah with the consortium. That's just amazing what you're doing there.
Oh, I was hoping you'd go to Jen and Liliana first, because I feel like mine will kind of come circling backwards. I feel like they might have more accurate numbers of what they're seeing in their organizations with reporting. So what I'll reflect on is, so recently I've been a part of a research team that has been doing a COVID-19 and domestic violence study. And so we've been interviewing folks, collecting data on what's going on in this current moment of a pandemic, and how that has has impacted what we think we know. And one of the things that we start off with is the work of Sonia Solari, my colleague, in which she talks about the iceberg effect of maltreatment, in which there are things that we know, and then there's so many things that we don't know. And so I think what Chris is reflecting on is right on. This is just the tip of the iceberg. When we have data, it is just the known. There's so much that we don't know because many people do not report, are unidentified, may live their lives as full human being adults into adulthood or in their childhood without ever anyone, acknowledging that what they went through is abuse or violence. But what we did see is that fatalities were on a downward trend since 2017. And in 2020, it just kicked right back up. So we know in its worst case scenario with fatality is that has gone up during COVID-19. We also know that with reportings with law enforcement, that was going up, but it dropped around July. And so there was a moment in which it kind of dropped down, and it didn't mean that people were not experiencing domestic violence or sexual violence. And it just meant they weren't reporting it. And so what we know is that our sense of safety during COVID-19 was really impacted because people might have been more afraid to reach out to law enforcement or even reach out to services. And so what we also were learning in this moment of pandemic is how organizations were impacted and had to radically alter the way that they were reaching out and supporting communities because we are in this moment of people wanting to be safe and then also people having to go to work and all those things because their livelihoods depend on it. And so I think this moment of COVID-19 has really exposed the inequities in our society, who has access to resources and who doesn't. Those that don't, have access to healthcare. I mean, in this moment, we're seeing how they're definitely being impacted and will be impacted with vaccines in itself. And so that's just kind of the things that we're seeing. And so I just wanted to reflect on that. My work is on human trafficking as well, and human trafficking intersects with domestic violence and sexual violence. And so that's when we're seeing cases in a particular severe form. And so we know that it's occurring in Utah and that it occurs in a range of industries from labor industries to sexual violence to even informal economies. And so human trafficking is occurring in Utah. And so as far as the data and the numbers, it exists, but what we know is based on what is reported, and that is just the tip of the iceberg.
That is such an important comment there. We have our numbers and they're appalling, yet we know there's probably significantly more people impacted. Children, as Chris talked about, and even college age, right? Even there's a whole thing with college age, and let alone older women as well. So Jen, would you make your comment? Yeah.
Sure. And I echo what Annie said. I think we were beginning to see a dip in the homicide rate, and we were really excited. There's been some really great collaboration between domestic violence providers and law enforcement, and we've been bridging a lot of these gaps. And then when COVID hit, we began to see was really this tough perspective for survivors, because the idea, stay-at-home order and isolate yourself from your family and your friends are all of really the tools of those that are perpetrating violence. And so it's tough for survivors in those instances, because that's kind of the thing we're trying to help bridge them through, and then that's being enforced. So I wanted to mention some statistics that we did see to mirror what Annie was saying, because the calls that we were getting from about March to June were really serious calls for domestic violence. And what I mean is, often we will get individuals calling kind of in the full range of violence, and maybe they're not really, they're still kind of figuring out, this could be violent, I'm not really sure. But people were so scared to access services that the calls that we were getting, they felt like they had no choice, right? They're like, this, I'm in such a violent situation. And I think our law enforcement was seeing that as well. Like for West Valley City, from March, they had a 28% increase in their domestic violence calls. And again, that's not necessarily, those are those high risk calls when they're calling law enforcement to come out, usually is what we see. Salt Lake City saw 30% more calls. And then another interesting thing for us was we have community-based partnerships with homeless providers and like Utah Community Action, Road Home, and they saw a 53% increase in individuals in high risk kind of flooding into their areas as well, like essentially looking into any place for a safe place to be. And that was over last year's increase. So definitely we saw that in our agency. It was interesting because we would see kind of an ebb and flow of the numbers depending on the levels of what we were seeing in COVID. The high risk kind of we would see sometimes a decrease. But again, what would happen is then once I think people had reached that breaking point, we would just be overwhelmed by calls for help and for support. So we saw like, so we don't turn any away. So we had a 77% increase in hotel costs from when COVID began, and then also in transportation costs and trying to get people into shelters all over Utah, wherever we could get them, as fast as we could see. So definitely, I think that Annie spoke really well to this, is with COVID, it pushes on those pressure points that were already there. And then unfortunately, we see a removal of those resources that people feel they have. And then as a provider, you know, we had about a week from the health department to switch everything to be COVID compliant, basically, for our staff and our team. And so, you know, luckily, we didn't have to stop any of our services. We were able to switch everything. But we had to spend a lot of time teaching individuals how to access services in a COVID environment. You know, what does that mean and what does that look like, and how do I gain access? So I've seen some real impact there on just individuals understanding how I can even come in and what does that mean. And we've had some, you know, some heartbreaking conversations with individuals who are like, well, I'm too scared to call law enforcement. I don't want them to come. Did they wear a mask? What happened? I mean, like all of those pieces that you kind of thought we've kind of started to educate on, we really have to start rethinking those conversations on a real educational level, as well as what does it mean now to call, and what does it mean to go get a protective order? What's court going to look like? Are they going to prosecute my case? All of those pieces, I think we're desperately behind and trying to catch up in messaging for survivors.
And that's you've made some critically important points here. And when women, specifically women, I know there's violence against men as well, but significantly more violence against women. But when they get to that point of the shelters, that's just one piece of the whole puzzle, right? And I know that I've talked to people that run shelters across the state, and they've really been full maxed out during the COVID time as well. So Liliana, I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think all that everyone said is, you know, what a lot of the programs are dealing with, and kind of trying to, you know, figure out how to navigate this new normal, right? This new way of looking at advocacy. But I know, for instance, organizations like the Rape Recovery Center, who are based out of Salt Lake County, they specifically just focus on sexual assault victims, and they had an enormous spike in phone calls, and then the amount of time they're spending on each individual phone call, because again, that you know, added a need to safety plan. Think about this when we're thinking about COVID, right? We're thinking about understanding that the rates of sexual violence are 80% of those cases are by someone they know, someone who had access to them, and now we're isolating, we're staying at home. So, you know, they're on the internet, right? They're, you know, there's a lot of different factors that play into, again, sexual violence. And so we definitely saw that increase. We definitely heard from organizations, like I said, like the Rape Recovery Center, who are even their engagement around prevention increased by 180%. So it was a significant increase of what was happening. Now, I think, you know, we all kind of said the numbers. Nearly 1 in 2 women in the US will experience some form of sexual violence in their lifetime. And Utah has the same overall rate. And again, I think the biggest key to you know, remember is that these are numbers based on those who are reporting. This is not is capturing everyone who's impacted by sexual violence. And we also know that rape is the only violent crime for which Utah's rate is higher than the national average, right? So hence why we need to really think about how we're engaging in this anti-violence movement, and how organizations like UCASA, like everybody who's doing this work, who's on this panel, we cannot do it on our own. We need that collective group, right? Our community members to kind of think about how they engage and how they interrupt these moments of violence, right, as well, right? And kind of come into this space as an upstander, right? Not just a bystander, but kind of stepping in into creating that shift within our society.
Thank you so much. I know we're actually having we're doing a new update of our sexual assault and domestic violence snapshots and our older data, which needs to be updated. There's not been good research in the States. So Annie, I'm glad you're doing some of that. Really, we've been saying for years from the old research that 1 in 3, and you're saying that's even more, 1 in 3 women in the state of Utah will experience sexual violence, and 1 in 6 throughout their lifetime will have experienced rape, and a lot in childhood and adolescence. So that's, and I've seen some questions. I'm going to ask one more question, and maybe we've got lots of questions, so maybe just a couple of you will answer the next one, and then a couple the next one, so we can move through. But I want to tell, I've been looking at some of the chat and questions that have come in, and we'll definitely spend some time at the end talking about resources. So just know that's coming. Like, how can you, if you're experiencing that yourself, but also there's so many of us that can connect with others and help provide resources, and there are resources. The thing that's sad to me, looking at our panelists and the jobs that you have and the interaction, is that there's so many people that don't even reach out, that are going through these because they don't understand the resources and reach out. So let me ask maybe a couple of you, whoever wants to respond to this next one. So, and then we'll take some questions for the chat after this. So describe the intersection of sexual violence with some other critical issues such as suicide, poverty, or race. And I know, Annie, you had mentioned some the human trafficking. There's definitely intersections. Would two of you maybe, who's feeling very compelled on this particular one? Okay, Liliana.
Awesome. I think, when we think about racial justice and we think about the intersections between sexual violence, I'm often reminded of a quote from Audre Lorde that says, "We do not live single issue lives," right? While, again, in this movement and reflecting on the work to end violence, it is imperative that we maintain that intersectional framework on racial justice, and seeking to identify ways that race should inform advocacy efforts aimed at increasing equity and equality in society. An intersectional approach really recognizes how multiple identities differently impact people's lives, and how solutions will recognize these complexities, right? We should also kind of really recognize that our work to support survivors of sexual assault includes the complex intersections and mobilizing models, such as organizations like that bring the Promotora program, which is really a program that provides expertise and leadership within local community and helps prevent and address the issues of sexual violence. Racial justice is a proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that promote that equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and outcomes for all, right? That is the collective power of it, really looking at how we cannot truly end sexual violence without looking how it intersects with racial justice, economic justice, and so forth, right? All of that is so intersected in how we should be looking at ending violence within our communities.
Oh, thank you so much. Who else would like to address that? Annie? Or no? I saw your hand going forward.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, sure. And I thought Liliana did such a beautiful job of framing the issues for us, and that we cannot forget that the anti-violence movement was deeply shaped by women of color, Native, queer, lesbian folks coming together. So when we look at the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, one of the older coalitions, it was actually founded by two-spirited folks, lesbians and women of color, Black women and Latinas and Asian and so forth. And so I think when I look at our history, it's important to think about that legacy work that happened. And also then so we can make decisions about how we continue to move forward together. That when we talk about intersectionality, that it means that we are all shaped by those power relationships. There is no one that is outside of it. And so it means coming together to think about these complexities that Liliana framed, but then also recognizing that when we look at studies of survivors who experience, for example, street-based harassment, that they can't tell whether it was because of their race or because of their gender, or was it that coming together, or was class coming in? And so sometimes it's hard to name, but it's important to frame those issues as shaping a person's experience. And that I think when I look at the work that I do on human trafficking, that's when we start to see then also the complexities of national origins come in. For example, for migrants, also how anti-Blackness impacts when we look at street-based economies, why it is that there are more people of color and women of color, as well as transgender people and queer who are in survival economies such as sex work, and then are more likely to be exploited in those industries. And so, yeah, it's a very complicated thing. And so then the question for me becomes, when we look at those complexities, then what do we do? And it means that we need to have a complex response, that there isn't just one way to respond to address issues of violence in our lives. It must come from a multiple axes, in multiple institutions, and also in the ground every day in grassroots organizing. And so it needs to happen in many places, which can make it daunting and overwhelming when people are like, well, what do we do? And it's like, well, I love the, one of the founders of the Polaris Project, one of the things that she said is that when we look at a movement, we all have a role in it, no matter how big or small. And so then I think that when those folks that are tuning in right now, your role in it is, you're all here with different roles in it, whether it's media writing about it, to folks who are learning about it, to folks who are going to go and work in communities to address it in the everyday. And so I think that that's to kind of move towards the what to do too.
Thank you so much. And a couple of the questions are related to actually the next question I had. So I'd love Jen and Chris to both respond to that. And then I'll get into a couple of other chat questions on the Q&A. So Chris, or Jen, either one, let's start with you. Let's discuss the key areas where survivors need help, from prevention to crisis response, to stabilization, to long-term recovery. And actually, Chris, I'd love you go through that process, right? With these women who have experienced these horrific, situations in their lives, that really go through those key areas. Thoughts?
Sure, thank you. So we focus in our care on the two ends of the spectrum, the prevention side and then the long-term recovery. We don't focus in our services on the acute care and the stabilization. All of them are essential. The whole continuum of care is critical. So I'll speak to where we focus, and I think Jennifer is a great counterpart on this because she focuses where we don't. So in the long-term recovery, what we're focusing on is fundamentally the PTSD symptoms that manifest. And with child sexual abuse, usually hit their peak or manifest most strongly in late 30s to 40s. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine this woman that has learned to cope with her childhood trauma, learned to deal with it, whether that's, just gritting through it or whatever it is. She's living a successful life in so many ways. And then this storm is just starting to develop inside her, and it's raging and it becomes overwhelming. That's when she seeks out our services. And we need more people in the space to provide those services, because she doesn't have a lot of choices. She has individual therapy, which usually by itself is not sufficient when it comes to sexual trauma. And then there's a couple of programs like ours, but they're not a lot of programs. So we definitely need to provide better services and give her the ability to raise her hand and say, I need help. Because what she sees in the news is she sees the woman who was just raped and says, oh, she has it so much worse off than I do.
Mhm.
And what I'm dealing with is not a big deal. And the money needs to go to her and she needs to be helped. And while that's true, this can't be a or, this has to be an and. It's so easy for her, due to the shame, to set aside her own healing because someone else needs it more. Someone's more acute, someone's more deserving. And we need to make it not only safer, but have the resources available for that woman that is seeking long-term recovery. And that turns on itself because abuse is very cyclical in nature. Yeah. And when you help her heal from that long-term PTSD, the risk factors for her own children go down significantly, and start helping us to break those cycles of the abuse that tends to stay in families over many generations.
And if some of you are interested in their ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, there's some interesting things when you look up and how they just go from generation to, if you're raised in that situation, no matter how much you work and try, that impact is going to impact your family's children and different things. So healing is so important. And Chris, I know, I can't remember how many women you take out 1 week for a retreat, but you have, is it 30, 25, 30?
It's the number of women, it's 24 per week, non-COVID, 16 per week during COVID.
And they get a whole week, but then of healing, all kinds of things, and then stay in touch with those resources as well. So I love that.
9 weeks post-retreat that we do online work with them to help them apply what they learn back at home. Because we've all been to retreats and we all come home excited, but if we don't have that support once we're back in home, we know what happens, right?
Jen.
Yes. Okay. So this feels like such a big topic, so I'm trying to like not take the whole time. I did want to start a little bit with prevention though, because I do, and thank you, Chris, for what you were saying. And I just want to add, I think that I would be remiss if I don't comment on, I think prevention is one of these key pieces that is the most underfunded service and support in our state. And we couldn't do the work we do without Liliana, without UCASA, without the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. And unfortunately, the funding, we're just not putting it there for our state. And we need these funds. So I hate to use this moment, but I'm going to, because I feel like we spend so much in response to these acts of violence that survivors, I don't want them to have to get to that path. Let's work more on supporting it. And our coalitions need our help and support to do that. They're the people we call as providers. I call them for technical support, for training for my team, helping us know how to help here. And so I just want to reiterate that prevention piece is what all of our whole state deserves, and we should invest in, and that should be an investment that we make. As far as crisis response services, most states our size and with our population would have about 40 providers where we have 15. And so we are underserving now in our response, where we're not, I hate to be the doomsayer on this, but we need to invest more prevention. And then in our response, we don't have enough funding in our response. We have to continually look at ways to stretch every dollar, to stretch every program. And so some of our larger programs, we become like this oh, well, we got to do everything because I have more of an infrastructure, instead of growing our real grassroots programs and letting them thrive and really work in the communities that they're working well. We haven't built that good network. And so unfortunately, there becomes this real divide on even gaining access to crisis response. And I loved, as we were talking earlier about some of the inequities and these access points, not being able to collectively fund our crisis response to be effective and to connect with our many communities is also a harmful piece of our response. I'm grateful that, you know, we have the services we have, but we need more. For stabilization, a real challenge of some of our funding is case management. You know, survivors deserve ongoing case management. And unfortunately, a lot of our funding is like, well, we'll give you funding for a year, or we'll give you funding for 6 months. And this idea that you can kind of time out how long someone's going to need help and support. We're grateful to provide those. And then for us, the big piece of this long term is safe housing. Our survivors and they need safe homes. And right now, as Utah's facing this housing crisis, a big thing we have to reevaluate is how do we help survivors in funding? So we have some funds for housing. We have both, you know, our really restricted funding that we get, and then we have individual donors that give us funds that allows us to just ask a survivor, what do you need to be stable? And we can fund that. And those dollars make the biggest difference for long-term stabilization. I've had people who needed a washer. So it's like, why do you need a washer? And they're like, well, after work, I've got to take all my kids. We have to go wash the clothes. We have to get on the public. I mean, all of those barriers were stopping them from being stabilized. And so luckily we had funding to say, well, here we can do this. And so again, I think a key part of that is looking for ways to provide stability so survivors can access that. And we're just helping support them in it. We're not maintaining it, we're not keeping it, but we're just there as supports. And there's so much to say on that, but I don't want to take too much time from all of you. So
you could each of you take the full time, but I do want to build on something Jennifer just said. What we know from the research, and some of you listening have heard me say this before, but the states that have more women in their state legislatures. So we slipped this year to 40th in the nation in terms of state legislatures. So states who have more women in their state legislatures give more funding to programs like we're talking about, give more funding to education and healthcare, but also social programs like homelessness and poverty, and support for prevention and the steps that we've talked about even. And so I'm just doing a pitch there. I know I sound like a broken record sometimes, but that is when we look at longer term systemic issues, that is, if we don't have more women who really deeply care about these, and that doesn't mean, you know, women that have even experienced, but you start learning and you notice these things from people around you, that when you look to your right or left or look at women in your classrooms, you know, there's a really, I get teary-eyed, there's a very good chance that women in my classrooms have or are experiencing these things. It's not just people from different parts. Anyway, okay, now I'll get off mine and move over to the next question. Our time is moving along, but there were a couple questions, and you can all see the chat coming in as well. So you can jump on some of those as well. But a few of the questions and the discussions that come on are just moving us to what to do next. But one of the things that I think is so important is how do we raise awareness of this? I mean, it's such a substantial problem, such a problem for so many women and for the state as a whole, but most people don't understand. They don't know this is a problem. How do we raise this awareness? And then let me just throw in another question that was asked as well. How do we raise awareness for everybody in the community? But how do we raise awareness and urgency to our legislature, right? So who would like to jump in on this to get us started? Or I can just call on you. Liliana, do you want to start on this one?
Sure. I think we've definitely seen this legislative session that there's been a lot of movement to really address sexual violence, domestic violence, right? And these inequities that we're talking about in a way, hopefully, that it is inclusive of all communities, right? That is looking at equity and inclusion every step of the way. But we've been getting these questions quite often, how can I, a member of the community, get involved? How can I play a part in this? And I think it comes, for the specific question with legislators, it's reaching out to them, letting them know what matters to you and why, right? And really connecting with organizations that are doing the work, that are in the trenches and that have a pulse on what's really happening in our communities and how you engage and how you get involved, and then reaching out to those legislators to tell them, hey, we have this issue we want to bring up, and like bring in those experts that are doing the work. I think Jennifer, said it really clearly. Our struggle is always going to be on ongoing funding. I also want to add that our programs, our DV programs, our SA programs across the state of Utah are getting significant budget cuts this year, right? And that those not only represent, if we're thinking about it across the board, right, we are already underfunded, and now we're getting other budget cuts. Those are positions, those are folks that are doing the prevention work, that are doing that case management, that are working with women, with girls and men and boys and all aspects, right, of work. And we're, how do we get our state to invest in this and prevention, invest in sexual violence, is by getting a collective voice to say, we care about these issues, we want to bring these forward. How do we do that? How do we engage in that? And recognize the incredible work that with little amount of funding, our programs are doing. Our programs are finding ways, and also COVID impacted those unrestricted funds that Jennifer is talking about, right? That folks are not donating as much right now because of COVID. All of that impacts our prevention, response, and moving forward into that long-term support that they receive. So I think there's a lot of work for us to do still, but my well-intentioned people, we need you, and these organizations need you. Go volunteer, go support, reach out to legislators, do that part so that we can be a stronger voice together around this issue.
I love that. And I will have each of the panelists actually send me, and we'll take some of the things on the chat as well. Send me any links. So you four, I'm looking at you, send me any links that you want to go out. We always email everybody that has attended, and people not just attended, but RSVP'd, which was over 400 people. So we will send some of these tools and websites and ways to engage in these topics in an email as soon as this, probably early next week, we'll do that. So who else would like, Liliana, thank you so much for that, to respond to this question, this topic of how do we raise awareness and with our legislature. Annie.
Yeah, I just want to say that when we think about prevention, that it's two levels or multiple levels. On the one hand, we're preventing it before it happens in a person's lifetime, but we're also doing the work of preventing it from happening again in a person's lifetime. I think that people oftentimes only think of it as like before it happens. It has to happen in both ways. And that what we know is that survivors of violence may experience multiple forms of violence in their lifetime, that it's not just one event necessarily, unfortunately. And so I think that the work of prevention that, Jennifer Campbell was appealing for is very important. This is ongoing work that needs to happen of educating people about the violence that occurs, but then also about the structures that lead to the violence. And that includes sexism, racism, classism, and so forth. And not as like abstract terms that we just theorize, but actually, how does this manifest in our everyday life, right? What does this look like when I am walking down the street? What does this look like when I am going to school and, a student, or when I'm working? What does this look like, really? And thinking about how we support our communities in that sense. And so that's kind of what I would recommend. And I think the appeal for resources is a huge one. One of the things that when I worked in community organizations, people always wanted to touch a survivor, I guess, connect with them in person. But I guess one of the questions that I had have is like survivors are part of our lives and in our communities. They are there. You don't need to go to a nonprofit to meet a survivor. You will find them, that they're in our communities, they're in your family, and they go to the churches that you go to. If you go to church, they are in your workplace. And so we are surrounded by many survivors in our communities. And so I think the appeal for resources is a huge one, and also ongoing education.
And I would add to your list sexual objectification. Oftentimes, and when you look at the research on that, and part of that plays out even in cosmetic surgery and different things, how we pull it in as women to objectify ourselves. But sexual objectification, sometimes people think it's not harmful, on social media, some of that. But the root and foundation of things that build up from there is very clear. And we know in the state of Utah that we have high pornography rates, and that's been tied to sexual objectification and so forth. So as you panelists have looked in the chat, is there anything you would like to, I've got more questions, but our time is moving. We just have like 13 minutes left and I need a minute to finish up. But anything that, before I move to another question, I know people really want information about resources and so forth, that we can talk about those, but any other topics that you're seeing?
If I can just add one thing, not that I even want to dare to add more to Liliana and Annie, but I just want to add vote. Ask your people who represent you what they know about violence, what their feelings are on it, and vote. Vote for people who recognize that this is happening, that's happening in our state. Vote for people who understand that they need to play a role in stopping it, and ask those questions of them so it's something they're already knowing that their constituents care about. And I think that's the piece that I would just add to all of the wonderful advice that was given, is we need to be represented by individuals who recognize this is happening and that they play a really powerful role in helping us establish more equity as we respond to this across our state. So vote, and then I will let you keep going on, Susan.
No, that's perfect. And actually, it's not just at the state legislative level. There are, although, it's interesting to look at how communities do things, but there are city councils, there's county commissioners, there's school boards that get into some of these issues of violence. So Jennifer, are you saying vote?
Yes, nice. I would say we've had Riverton City Council, West Jordan City Council, they've volunteered, they donate space for us to have our resource centers in. They've made that contribution. So I would agree. I would say everyone who is representing you, give them your voice and let them know that you want to see what they can do. This to me becomes a beautiful partnership with our representatives that they can have, and can cause so much great things to change and happen on a systemic level. That's one of those things that really gives me hope, that we can stop violence, but we have to have voices in those positions that see this and understand the realities of what survivors are facing.
And one of the things that many people don't realize, if you're familiar with the research of the Utah Women in Leadership Project, you may know this, and we're having updates, but there is a specific one research snapshot on domestic violence, and there's another one on sexual assault, and they're just 3 or 4 pages, but they give you and again, we're updating both of those, but they give you, and we have infographics too, and some discussions podcasts as well. And Annie's got other resources too that we'll send out as well. So anything else that you want to jump on that our people who are watching and listening have been wondering about? Chris, I saw your microphone come up.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions in the chat that touch on prevention, and we've talked some about it. I want to maybe address specific to prevention as it relates to child sexual abuse and some of the things that we can and need to do there. The only way to stop violence is to stop the person that's going to be violent. There's no amount of preparation you can give to a potential victim that will 100% exclude them from being victimized, nor is it his or her responsibility to make sure it doesn't happen anyway. And so the only way to solve this problem is to learn why people perpetrate and help them to stop perpetrating. That's the only way to solve the big problem. There's lots of smaller problems we can solve along the way, but it's the only way to solve the big problem. We have a real opportunity with child sexual abuse to tackle a major portion of that problem that is relatively easy to solve. And that is, studies show that up to 50% of child sexual abuse is perpetrated by an older minor, with the average age being 14. So think a 14-year-old perpetrating against a 7 or 8-year-old. The impact on the 7 or 8-year-old's the same, but that 14-year-old, only a very small percentage of them are actual pedophiles or will turn into long-term perpetrators or abusers. Very few of them will even do it again once they've done it the first time. This is a place where intervention can be extremely effective. And if we can knock out 50% of the problem with relatively little effort compared to the effort it will take for the rest of the problem, I think there's argument that we should focus on that. And so how do we do that? The research continues to produce information that the best protective factors are by engaging parents to be proactive with their kids. And that's on both sides, both in preventing their kids from being abused and preventing their kids from being the abuser. But can you find a mom in the state of Utah that wants to say, yeah, my son or my daughter has a good chance of abusing another child by age 14? Parents are not there yet. They're not ready to accept that responsibility yet. And in my opinion, and this is where you're going to get my biases, that's where we got to target. There's no amount of legislation, there's no amount of funding, there's no amount of after-school programs, there's no amount of response resources that can solve the problem without an engaged parent or primary caregiver. They're the linchpin. All those other things are critical, but they won't solve the problem. And I would even argue they won't even move the needle without us engaging parents. So the awareness, to your question about awareness and to the many questions about prevention, we have to target the parent. And our parents are starting to show an aptitude for the topic. The broad social response to Me Too was a wave where it was like, wow, people are listening. There's been a broad social response recently to trafficking, but those are easier for parents to grab onto because it's someone else's child and someone else's problem. I'll give money or I'll raise my voice for someone else to, stop their child from being trafficked. But now we have to get that next big wave and get parents to the point where they can say, my child's at risk of both perpetrating and my child's at risk of being perpetrated against. And there are things I can do that will reduce the likelihood from that happening. And that's where I think we need to start on our prevention efforts and where our prevention programming needs to be hyper-focused.
And you're doing that, Chris. You're going to have, and you have some already, don't you have some resources for parents to start these conversations?
We do. We have a lot of resources, but it's hard work. It's hard to get to parents. They're so caught up in a million different things they can spend their time on and a million ways they can protect their kids. We have to elevate this topic so it's front of mind for them. It has to go through the same transition car safety went through in my lifetime, right? When I was little, I was never buckled in. By the time I was a parent, there was no way I wasn't going to buckle in my kid. What happened in that time, right? There was a major societal shift with parents. The same thing has to happen as it relates to sexual violence. That same type of monumental shift where it's in the forefront of the parent's mind as one of the protective factors they think about as it relates to their kids.
And that is got some complexity in getting that to the parents, but also raising awareness, which takes millions of dollars in campaigns and so forth. So I just looked at our time, and what I need to do now, because we're in the last few minutes and we could keep going on and on. We've just scratched the surface. Know if you're listening on, I'm going to keep the chat, and we're going to get some resources to you. But what I want each of you to do now is you each have like 1 minute is all. And I think I'll start with let's have Jennifer go first, then Annie, then Chris, then Liliana. Let's have you finish, and just give us in 1 minute some final advice, anything you would like to share in your thoughts. Jennifer?
Sure. I guess I would just say, I think we all can serve a role in stopping violence. I really believe this. I believe every one of us can do this. And I see it in three ways. I've always thought of it this way, and maybe it's because I'm a simple person, but I think recognizing what violence is, understanding that it's happening, that people are experiencing it, you could be perpetuating it. You don't, like, be open to this idea of recognizing that this is happening in our communities. I believe we need to know how to respond appropriately to violence, whether it's something we're experiencing, something we've perpetuated, or something we've seen. We need to understand what responding looks like. We need to believe those that come forward. We need to support them on the paths they take in justice and healing. And then we need to end the silence, I think, that's perpetuated by those who are committing acts of violence. And last, we need to refer. We need to know resources and where they are so that we can safely refer individuals to get help. And I feel like as we look at these three things in whatever capacity we can do that, we will change the impact of violence in our communities.
Excellent. Annie?
Wow. Thank you. So I would say that one of the things that I learned from when I was domestic violence trained in California is that we each have the ability to be an abuser. They are not a special group that is out there. It is within any person to actually have that capacity to enact violence on another human being. And so then it takes a lot of work to then also then think about how the very same structures that create survivors are the same structures that create abusers. They are part of our communities. They are part of our families. They're the people that we work with. And so I think that when I think of our response to issues of violence is that it requires that all of us work together to address it in these complex ways. It's not some special condition out there, the bad person over there. They are part of our community. And so then that is one thing. The second thing I wanted to also say is that we did a study on stigma, and what we found is that a lot of survivors in Utah experience stigma as they navigate different institutional services, from medical to social services to law enforcement and what have you. And that I think that there is still much important work in naming the problem, that we need to be comfortable talking about violence in our communities and naming what's going on, so it doesn't become this kind of thing that people experience where they feel shame about it. They shouldn't be ashamed of what they went through. This is something that happened to them, right? And that they survived and that they're incredibly resilient. And so that would be the second thing I would say. I would say that last thing, super random, but food insecurity is a big thing. And that is something we also cannot forget about, is that while there's housing insecurity, there's also food insecurity that's going on right now during the pandemic. That means that survivors are staying in abusive conditions because they're food dependent and housing dependent as well. And so that we need to address the basic needs of everyone.
I love that. Chris?
I'll be really quick because I made my impassioned plea a few minutes ago. I'll just say that a significant problem like this can be paralyzing and overwhelming. But research, particularly things going on in brain research, are giving us solid answers on both prevention and healing. And though neuroscience and neurobiology may be in its infancy, we're getting the answers we need to start taking action. And it's worth our time to learn how to take action against these issues. And I'm just super grateful for our other panelists today. I love the expertise on this call. And thank you, Dr. Madsen, for doing your part to raise awareness. It's a beautiful thing.
Thank you. And Liliana?
I think the biggest message, and to kind of end in this work of DV and sexual violence, is that we all play a part in this, and that we should listen and believe survivors. that when someone comes to share with you their story of violence, it is the first step to breaking that cycle of abuse. It's the sole responsibility on the person who did the harm to be responsible and bear the responsibility, not the survivors. So call out victim blaming and counter the idea that it's on the victim's responsibility to stop the violence, right? That we have to combat those dangerous traditional standards around this issue of sexual violence. Survivors are speaking up more than ever. We had that shift in the #MeToo movement, right? That really centered the experience of folks that are experiencing these type of violence in their lives. So what you say is say, I believe you, I'm here for you, how can I help? Because many times survivors are going to those people before they reach out to programs like ours. You have that part to play. And I just want to end by sharing this little quote that was shared with me from one of my directors, and it says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has."
Thank you so much. That's one of my favorite quotes. So I'm so happy that you used that. I'd like to thank the panelists for their wonderful comments. I cannot believe how fast our 75 minutes came. It felt like we were just surfacing. There's so much more information out there. Thanks again to all of you for joining, and thanks to our panelists. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.